From the first minute Elon Musk stepped into the spotlight of Steven's studio, something was clearly off. The usual thunderous applause that greeted celebrity guests had a subdued quality, almost as if the crowd sensed a disruption on the horizon. Elon, dressed in his signature dark tones, took his seat with an air of focus, ready to promote his newest ventures. But behind his calm expression was an unease he couldn't entirely suppress. Steven, ever the master of balance between charm and cynicism, opened the conversation in his typical fashion. Smooth, clever, and laced with wit. At first the banter was controlled, the topics tame. Elon responded with poise, outlining his latest innovations in space technology and artificial intelligence. It seemed, for a brief moment, that the segment would proceed without incident. But as the conversation edged into deeper waters, the tension began to rise. Steven's tone began to shift. His questions lost their playfulness and grew sharper, more deliberate. What began as friendly teasing evolved into pointed criticisms. He questioned not just Elon's projects, but his motivations, suggesting there was something self-serving behind all the grand declarations of saving humanity. The studio audience, usually a source of laughter and encouragement, grew quieter, with every probing remark. It wasn't that Steven was shouting or being aggressive. In fact, the calmness of his voice made his words land harder. He brought up Elon's public missteps, spacecraft explosions, the backlash over workplace policies, controversies that Elon had weathered but likely hadn't expected to revisit on a late-night stage. The questions came in rapid succession, leaving little room for full answers. Elon tried to keep up. He explained, clarified, and defended, but his responses began to shorten. The fluid rhythm of the interview slowed as he struggled to regain control of the narrative. The smiles faded. His eyes narrowed. He began blinking more frequently, a subtle but telling sign that the strain was setting in. Then came the moment that changed everything. Steven cited a string of criticisms from former employees, quotes that painted a picture of a cold, demanding leadership style. Elon tried to pivot, speaking about ambition, the burden of trying to change the world. But Steven didn't let go. He questioned the human cost of Elon's vision, pressing him on the sacrifices others had made for goals they never agreed to. A hush fell over the studio. The humor was gone. The segment had shifted from a light-hearted exchange to something far more personal. Elon looked straight ahead, momentarily lost in thought, as if he were deciding whether to fight back or stay silent. His voice, when it returned, had lost its usual precision. There was hesitation in every word, as though the weight of the questions had shaken something loose beneath the surface. The commercial break arrived without warning, and the screen went black. But inside the studio the energy was heavy. Steven leaned back in his chair, stone-faced. Elon didn't move. The crowd clapped, uncertain, their reactions subdued. In those final seconds before the cut to break, one thing was obvious. This interview was no longer about promotion. It was about reckoning. When the cameras returned from break, the audience clapped out of habit, not excitement. The energy in the room had curdled into something dense and expectant. Steven was still seated in his usual posture, but the glint in his eyes had hardened. Elon, meanwhile, had grown quieter, his earlier confidence replaced with something more cautious, wary even. He resumed speaking with the same polished cadence, trying to return the focus to his work. He spoke of long-term goals for humanity, about the need to think beyond borders and lifespans, to consider what kind of future civilization could build. But the momentum was gone. His voice lacked its earlier spark, and the audience felt it. Steven didn't interrupt, but he didn't let the shift slide either. He allowed Elon to speak, then calmly laid out a counterpoint that cut through the idealism. He pointed out the glaring contradictions between the utopian promises and the real world consequences. The push for innovation had cost jobs. The demand for perfection had created high-pressure environments, The so-called revolution in energy and transportation hadn't been without casualties. And then Stephen pressed harder, pivoting into personal territory. He mentioned Elon's public presence, how often he was online, how frequently he courted controversy. There was a deliberate edge to the question, as if implying that the chaos wasn't a side effect but a choice. Elon flinched, just barely, but it was enough. That subtle reaction told the entire studio that Stephen had struck a nerve. Elon tried to steer the conversation away. He talked about misunderstood intentions, about how disruption always comes with discomfort. But the pace of his words quickened, his usual command of the room visibly faltering. It wasn't a breakdown yet, but something was clearly cracking beneath the surface. Stephen kept pushing. He mentioned accusations that had followed Elon over the years, stories of harsh leadership, of unattainable expectations, of burned-out employees who once believed in a dream but left feeling discarded. And he didn't bring them up as gossip or tabloid fodder. He brought them with receipts, citing specific incidents, ones Elon had long moved past publicly but had never addressed this directly. Elon leaned forward in his seat, speaking more quietly, now trying to explain that changing the world never came without cost. That failure was part of invention. That no leader, however visionary, was immune to mistakes. But each point felt more like a plea than a statement. And with every attempt to justify himself, the tension only grew. The audience watched in near total silence, barely breathing. Elon's shoulders rose with each inhale, his hands occasionally fidgeting. His voice started to waver during a story he shared about isolation, how it felt to be constantly scrutinized, celebrated by some and despised by others, never knowing who to trust. It was a rare glimpse of emotion, one not filtered through branding or performance. And still, Stephen didn't let up. He acknowledged the loneliness, but used it to make a larger point, suggesting that perhaps the very systems Elon helped build were contributing to the alienation felt by millions. It was not an accusation. It was a dismantling. Calculated, controlled, devastating. Something in Elon shifted. His eyes lingered in one place too long. His jaw tightened. He paused mid-thought, exhaling deeply, as if he were trying to hold something in. The room felt suspended, as if everyone instinctively sensed what was coming next. He blinked, slowly, and his hand subtly moved across his lap as though steadying himself. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. The moment didn't erupt with noise or theatrics. Instead, it unfolded with eerie quiet. Elon fell silent, his expression tightening as his eyes glistened. The lights above didn't change, but the atmosphere in the studio felt like it dimmed. The strongest man in the room was unraveling, not with shouts, but with silence. By now, the energy in the studio had transformed into something somber and surreal. What had begun as a tense exchange had slowly deteriorated into a raw unraveling. Elon, the man so often portrayed as impenetrable, sat with a stillness that unsettled everyone watching. His usual spark had dulled. The charismatic veneer, the calculated confidence, gone. The silence after his last attempted answer stretched far longer than anyone expected. Stephen, usually quick to jump into any pause, stayed quiet too. Whether it was restraint or realization, he let the moment breathe, giving everyone the space to absorb what was happening. Elon shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on a spot just past the cameras. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no sound came. The pressure had finally reached its threshold. Then, slowly, visibly, the tears came. Not a flood, but quiet, steady streaks down his cheeks. His chest rose and fell in shallow waves, his hands clasped together tightly in his lap. No one moved. The audience was locked in place. Even the crew behind the cameras stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The moment wasn't just television. It was something altogether different. The fall of a man, not in reputation or status, but in the silent, private way that exhaustion and emotional fatigue finally catch up when the world isn't looking away. Stephen's face tightened. He looked at Elon for a long second, his body language shifting. The triumph that had lingered in his posture earlier was gone, replaced by something more reflective. This wasn't a win. This wasn't a gotcha moment. It was a mirror, showing what happens when relentless pressure and scrutiny finally strip someone bare. Elon tried to speak again, just one line, maybe two, but the effort cost him. His voice cracked, and he paused mid-sentence, breathing through the silence like a man holding back a tide. The lighting on stage, so often a theatrical spotlight, now felt harsh, like it was exposing something deeply personal that wasn't meant to be seen. The studio crew moved in. A producer gave the signal, and the feed was cut mid-sentence. The live broadcast abruptly transitioned to a holding screen, followed by an earlier pre-recorded segment, with no explanation. Back in the studio, Stephen stood slowly as Elon, still, visibly shaken, remained seated, breathing deeply and wiping his face with the back of one hand. Stephen approached him but said nothing. For a few seconds the two men stood side by side, not as host and guest, but as humans caught in a moment neither had expected. Elon eventually rose and walked off stage with quiet resolve. No handshakes, no words. Just a long walk into the shadowed hallway beyond the set. In the control room, producers argued in whispers about how to spin the moment. But everyone knew this wouldn't be spun. It couldn't be. It was already out in the world. Clips had been recorded, screenshots taken, reactions, flooding social media with stunning speed. Within minutes, Elon's tearful expression had been shared by thousands, dissected in real time by viewers trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. What made it so jarring wasn't just the tears. It was what they symbolized. Elon Musk, one of the most public, analyzed, and ambitious figures of modern times, had finally been pierced by something even he couldn't outthink or outrun. Not a business rival, not a market crash, but raw emotion, triggered by a conversation that went further than anyone anticipated. The fallout was immediate. Some viewers criticized Stephen for going too far, accusing him of turning an interview into a targeted ambush. Others praised the segment, claiming it revealed the real person beneath the carefully curated persona. But there was one thing nobody could argue: what had happened on that stage was real, and reality, in an era of spectacle, cuts deeper than any performance. In the hours that followed the broadcast, a storm of opinions swept across every platform. Viewers, pundits, and public figures all weighed in, their takes ranging from sympathy to scorn. Some saw a billionaire unraveling under the weight of his own ego. Others saw a man pushed too far, stripped of his defenses by a host who had gone from entertainer to interrogator. But no matter the stance, the conclusion was the same. What happened between Elon and Stephen wasn't just an interview. It was a cultural moment. The studio, long emptied of its audience, remained silent well past midnight. Stephen stayed behind, pacing the stage where it had all unfolded. He had spent his career cutting through spin, wielding wit as a weapon. But tonight felt different. The laughter, the applause, the usual high of a provocative show, none of it lingered. What remained was the image of Elon, alone beneath the lights, quietly falling apart before millions. By the next morning, headlines were everywhere. News outlets scrambled for commentary. Public relations teams for both men issued no formal statements. The silence from both camps only fueled the intrigue. People didn't just want to know what happened. They wanted to understand why it happened, and what it meant. Then, 2 days later, Elon emerged, not at a press conference, not through an elaborate statement, but through a quiet, handheld video uploaded to his own platform. The background was simple, the lighting natural. His voice, though composed, was subdued. He spoke of exhaustion, of pressure, of how the role he had taken on, willingly or not, had become heavier than anyone could truly see from the outside. He didn't mention Stephen directly, but his words acknowledged the moment. He described what it meant to carry vision and responsibility, while being misunderstood, even vilified. He admitted to having lost himself at times in the ambition to fix the world, and in that moment, his vulnerability struck a chord that even the tears on live television had not. The video went viral, not out of spectacle, but resonance. People began to view the original segment with new eyes. What had felt like a takedown began to look more like a wake-up call, a reminder that brilliance does not equal invincibility, and that even icons can buckle when pushed beyond reason. Stephen returned to air the following night and opened the show not with a joke, but with candor. He spoke directly to the camera, acknowledging the intensity of the previous episode. He didn't offer an apology. He offered reflection. He admitted the power that comes with hosting a platform as influential as his, and how that power demands careful handling. He didn't diminish what was said, but he did admit that the impact had lingered with him more than any segment in recent memory. And rather than framing the moment as a win or loss, he framed it as something else entirely. A mirror held up to the very nature of how we engage with our heroes, our innovators, and ourselves. For a late-night show known for laughter and satire, the honesty landed with unusual gravity. The aftermath became less about sides and more about awareness. Conversations sprang up everywhere, about burnout, about public pressure, about the fine line between critique and cruelty. The spectacle faded, but the substance remained. And for Elon, the tears did not become a weakness to be exploited. They became a turning point. In the weeks that followed, he stepped back from the spotlight briefly, restructured parts of his companies, and re-emerged not with bravado, but with clarity. Not rebranding, but recentering. Stephen, too, continued with his show, but something had shifted. There was still humor, still sharp commentary, but behind it all was the memory of that night, when two men collided under the weight of expectation and emerged changed. What began as confrontation ended as transformation. And for everyone watching, it was a powerful reminder that strength is not measured in control, but in the moments when control is lost, and humanity is revealed.